Hello and welcome to Mariology without apology. This is Dr. Mark Miravalle. I'm particularly excited about today's program because I'd like the opportunity to respond in offering some clarifications regarding some fundamental principles that have been the foundation of certain more ecumenical or more cultural Mariological emphases in the last several years. So let's set the stage. Now, this is a generalization, but it has a truth behind it. And that is, much of contemporary Mariology over the last 15, 20 years has very strong emphases, the themes of A, ecumenism, and B, culture, in guiding its method, its course of study, even its thematic developments. Now, is it not true that we are all called to be ecumenical in the proper sense of what that word means, as it's defined in Vatican II, in the document on ecumenism, and also further understood through John Paul II's Ut Unum Sint, his 1994 encyclical? Certainly, that means prayer and dialogue towards unity, which ultimately must come in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. It's very clear St. John Paul II warns against any doctrinal compromise. And even Redintegratio Unitatis from the Second Vatican Council says really that it's reprehensible, it's a false Irenicism to dilute doctrine for the sake of ecumenism. So while ecumenism should be on all of our hearts and souls, it does not call for a de-emphasis, a lack of development, a discouragement towards the authentic doctrine regarding Our Lady as has been taught by the papal magisterium, both at the council, after the council, and before the council. We're going to talk a lot about this hermeneutics of continuity, which Pope Benedict XVI Emeritus gives us, that says you've got to see a continuum of especially the papal magisterial teaching that comes before the council, that which is in the council, and that which then follows the council by way of authentic interpretation of the council. This hermeneutics of continuity versus an idea of a hermeneutics of rupture, that you have this, in our case, Mariological development, Mariological doctrine, articulation, and then it comes to the council, and then the council starts something totally new, both regardless and irrespectful of what comes before. That simply can't be called a hermeneutics of continuity, and quite frankly, it can't be called a proper understanding of the development of doctrine, even including ecumenical councils, which are themselves a further call of development, but not regression. So what I'd like to do in our program today is to go through 10 foundational points that are oftentimes the underpinning concepts of some of the species of more ecumenical and cultural Mariology, which we've seen after the council, but particularly and especially in the last 15 to 20 years, and to try to respond to that positively in showing, while certainly we should have an ecumenical and a cultural concern, ultimately it must rest on a continued understanding and development, respect for, articulation of the Church's doctrine regarding Our Lady. Why? Because love follows truth, both personally and liturgically, officially as the universal prayer of the Church. It has to be based on authentic doctrine. In this case, the authentic doctrine regarding Our Lady, which did not start in 1962, as we know. It starts with Jesus and the apostles and this beautiful development of doctrine, which Cardinal Newman, St. Cardinal Newman, articulates so well, in which he will specify listening to the laity when it comes to issues proximate to devotion. And certainly, Marian doctrine fits in that category most profoundly. We'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. So let's go over these 10 categories, which again are oftentimes part of and sometimes the foundation of some of the current more ecumenical cultural Mariology, which has been articulated and published in the last few years. So let's start with principle number one. And principle number one, and these are focused on or relative to the movement for a fifth Marian dogma, for a solemn papal definition of Our Lady's role as our spiritual mother. The words of Jesus, "Behold your mother." Inclusive and really founded on her unique role with Jesus in the redemption, her consequent distribution of graces, as Lumen Gentium 62 talks about, that she intercedes for the gifts of eternal life, and her ongoing role in intercession and protection, i.e. advocacy for the church. Okay, so let's start with issue number one, and that is the idea that both what Cardinal Mercier started, we'll talk about Cardinal Mercier in a few moments if you're not familiar. I've done a few Mariology without apology pieces specifically on the movement for the fifth Marian dogma as it started in the late 19th century, carried through the 20th century, but particularly inspired by the renowned Belgian Cardinal Desiré Mercier. So the first issue is this a, quote, triple dogma movement, seeking a definition of three separate doctrines of co-redemptrix, mediatrix, and advocate? Because as such, some of the commentary would say, well, this is impossible because you're really talking about a triple dogma and not a single dogma. Clearly, both in the writings of Cardinal Mercier, who again starts this movement technically back in 1915, it is a specific call for either Mary's universal mediation, which is a more philosophical and metaphysical explanation, or more pastorally and simply a definition of Our Lady's role as the spiritual mother of all humanity, but founded on her co-redemptive role and her role in the distribution of graces. If you go back and read Mercier carefully, it's very clear in his pastoral letters, in his formulations, that while he's calling for a definition of Mary's spiritual motherhood or universal mediation, it is always supported, grounded, girded on Our Lady's role as co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces. So with the revival of this movement for a fifth Marian dogma, which happens in the early 1990s for a movement called Vox Populi Mariae Mediatrici, the voice of people for Mary Mediatrix, it is almost the constant formulation of a single solemn definition. It is a definition of her spiritual motherhood, that she is mother of all people, spiritually mother of all peoples, but inclusive of her three maternal functions, that Mary uniquely participates with Jesus and under Jesus, totally dependent on Jesus, in the work of redemption, which Vatican II says over and over and over. And for this reason, as Lumen Gentium 61 will say, because of her unique role with Jesus in the redemption, she is a, quote, mother to us in the order of grace. That's Lumen Gentium 61 and following with Lumen Gentium 62. Taken up into heaven, she doesn't lay aside this saving office, but by her manifold intercession continues to bring us the gifts of eternal life, which is why she is properly invoked under the title of mediatrix. That's all in Lumen Gentium 62. So it is not a movement seeking a triple dogma of three separate, isolated terms. It is rather the three aspects of her singular spiritual motherhood of all humanity. The common motive, although this has been theologically explained several times by several authors, the idea of one mother performing the united tasks of spiritual suffering, in the maternal order of looking at the need to suffer for one's child. Secondly, that a mother nourishes her child. And then thirdly, a mother protects her child. So this trifold role doesn't bespeak three mothers, nor three separate doctrines. These are three critically related doctrines as three manifestations, three functions of her singular motherhood, which is the proposed object of the definition. So keep in mind, if a Holy Father were seeking a solemn definition, he would make his own formulation. And certainly the Vox Populi movement has always respected that, but the movement has not been calling for a triple dogma, but rather a singular dogma with three aspects, which are well represented in the classical titles of co-redemptrix, mediatrix, and advocate. There certainly could be understandable misunderstanding when one hears those three titles, but it's very important to look at particularly some of the vota, the petitions that have been sent from the Vox Populi movement. And again, if you're not familiar with this movement, this is a movement that since the early 90s is an international movement, not a U.S. movement. It's an international movement on 5 continents, which has gathered 8 million petitions from 180 countries, including well over 600 bishops and over 50 cardinals, asking the Holy Father for this solemn definition. Look at the ink, examine the formulations, and you will see that it is typically formulated as a call for the definition of Mary's spiritual motherhood under these three critical aspects. So at any rate, for clear clarification, it is not a triple dogma movement. It's a singular dogma movement, that she is the spiritual mother of all peoples, inclusive, because theologically dependent on her roles, unique with being with Jesus in the redemption, in distributing the graces of the redemption, and her intercession and her protection for the human family. Okay. So, not a triple dogma, a single dogma, a fifth and a final dogma. Some argue, well, why would you say final dogma? Because there's nothing else to define. There's no other clear doctrines regarding Our Lady other than her spiritual maternity, inclusive of these three aspects. Okay, second issue. This is the issue regarding Marian cooperation versus Marian co-redemption. And in some of these articles, the presupposition is that Marian co-redemption is certainly legitimate because that's throughout the teaching of the council, but Marian co-redemption is not legitimate. So let's just examine that thesis. Well, first of all, to co-redeem is to cooperate in the redemption. Look at any of the classic definitions of co-redemption. And by the way, co-redemption, if we're going to look at that hermeneutics of continuity, was, along with Our Lady's universal mediation, the principal Mariological thesis of discussion throughout the 20th century. Just look at the texts, look at the volumes, look at the periodicals, look at the journals, or even look at Protestant commentary on what was principally concerned within Catholic Mariology, and they will testify that the principal concern, focus, thesis of 20th century Mariology in the Roman Catholic Church, as they say, is the issues of co-redemption and mediation. So, as the authors throughout the 20th century define co-redemption, they're talking about Mary's unique cooperation in the redemption. So, to co-redeem is to cooperate. Now, I think we just have to be honest about why is there this allergy concerning the term co-redemption. Well, it seems to be more of a politically correct within ecclesiastical circles or perhaps an ecumenical concern than a metaphysical concern. So if to co-redeem is exactly to cooperate, what do these words mean? Cooperare, to work with. Co-redeem is Colossians 1:24. We are God's co-workers in this work of redemption. St. Paul will use cooperation terms 5 different times in 5 different epistles. John uses it in terms of the Christian call of evangelization. So let's just be clear, and one can say, well, I do think that one has a more sensitive ecumenical concern. Well, that's an argument that has to be examined. What is not, in my opinion, a legitimate argument is to say there's anything theologically wrong with the concept of co-redemption. It simply is referring first to Our Lady's unique role with and under Jesus in giving him his body in her great fiat, and also in, as Vatican II says, Lumen Gentium 58, in persevering with him unto the cross, where she consented to the immolation of the victim born of her. That's co-redemption. That's how Roschini defines it. That's how the German Mariologist Hauke defines it. Even in a recent piece, the Roman theologian Father Perella talks about the classic understanding of co-redemption. So let's be clear that when you have even papal theologians, Cardinal Ciappi, after him Cardinal Codier, who are defending co-redemption. Father Gallo, a Vatican writer who was certainly a consultor to Pope John Paul II, and it is somewhat known that he was a contributor to some of his Mariological publications. They all publicly defend co-redemption after the Second Vatican Council. So let's just be clear about the metaphysics and the theology, and then distinguish that from the ecumenical concerns of some. I would personally hold, along with these authors, all after the council, as well as the over 600 cardinals and bishops who confirmed their desire for a solemn definition of Our Lady as co-redemptrix, that there's not an intrinsic problem with this term. The Praenotanda from the first schema from Vatican II said specifically that the term co-redemptrix is, quote, absolutely true in itself, end quote. We got to remember that in the discussion. And so co-redemption is a legitimate theological term to speak about Our Lady's unique participation in the redemption, her unique cooperation in giving birth to the Savior and suffering with Jesus. And then ultimately, as Pius XI back in the 1930s, and St. John Paul II repeatedly called you and me to be co-redeemers in Christ. But what about the statement of Pope Benedict XVI when he's blessing the people at Fatima, in his Fatima journey? He's blessing them with the Eucharist, and he's blessing the sick. And he literally says, I encourage you to become, quote, redeemers in the Redeemer. How can we possibly say that co-redemption is a inappropriate preconciliar term when you have the popes using that analogy to express being a redeemer? Don't even say, Benedict didn't even use co-redeemer, a redeemer in the Redeemer. And that's the call to participate in really the new evangelization that we're praying and offering for our brothers and sisters who do not now accept Christ to accept Christ. So again, it's a completely legitimate theological term, post-conciliar, used by popes and certainly by theologians, papal, cardinals, bishops. Again, the other concern can be the question of the ecumenical sensitivity, but once again, we have to be careful of opting to eliminating terms rather than explaining terms to our brothers and sisters who are not Catholic, because then you have to ask, where's that going to stop? What about consecration? What about transubstantiation? What about papal infallibility? Sometimes people say, well, that co-redemptrix term, it takes so much explanation, you have to explain it away. How much explanation do you have to give to properly explain papal infallibility? Infallibility just means inability to err. Well, the Pope can err. He just can't err in faith in morals, especially in the extraordinary magisterium. That takes plenty of discussion and distinctions. So too with the concept of co-redemption. Okay, number 3. Yeah, this is the premise that Vatican II's treatment on Our Lady, and some almost assert that theologians that don't agree with them are understating the authentic Marian doctrine of the Council, which is a rather strong assertion. But the assertion is that Vatican II speaks only about Mary's participation in the application of the graces. Excuse me, I keep doing that. It has an automatic turn off, but we can handle that. That Vatican II only deals with the application of graces, but not in the obtaining of graces. My friends, all I can say is go back to the ink, read it for yourselves. Lumen Gentium 56, where it talks about The fathers of the church clearly are articulating that Mary's role was not passive, but active with Jesus in the great work of the redemption. That's in the work of the redemption, not in the application of the graces of the redemption. Lumen Gentium 58 is a whole paragraph talking about Mary persevering in union with her Son unto Calvary, where she consents to the immolation of the victim. She suffers what he suffers in her heart. And as a result of this, Jesus then pronounces her as a mother to us. Behold your mother, and then confirmed in Lumen Gentium 61, where, again, that Mary, throughout her life and the life of Jesus, is participating, is cooperating in the work of the redemption. And then it says, for this reason. So period to that sentence, that she's participating in the work of redemption unto the cross throughout her whole life, period. And that's a reference to her active co-redemption. Then, quote, for this reason, she is a mother to us in the order of grace. Well, that's when you're talking about application. But Lumen Gentium 56, Lumen Gentium 57, which confirms that Mary throughout her life is working with Jesus in the work of salvation. You can't simply dismiss that as application. Application is the part 2. That's the distribution of the merits of Jesus at Calvary. Part 1 is her active participation, as Father Gallo would articulate in an article in L'Osservatore Romano in the 1990s, her active participation in obtaining the graces of the redemption. And that's objective co-redemption. So, and again, we have the benefit of St. John Paul II, who gives us repeatedly a papal authoritative interpretation of what is given at the Second Vatican Council. John Paul will repeatedly say that Mary's participation with Jesus in the work of redemption is a, quote, contribution to the redemption of us all. That's Salve Vici Dolores number 25. I don't know how much clearer it could get. He's likewise clear in a Wednesday audience of April 9th, 1997, where he talks about her unique cooperation in the work of redemption, which then has its impact on all of us. So it is not appropriate, it's not in the ink, it's not in the text to try to secondarily interpret that all the treatment of Vatican II of Our Lady is only regarding part 2, distribution, only regarding application of the graces, because the text bespeaks Mary's active participation in the act of redemption itself, which, by the way, is confirmed by a September 15th, 2021, a homily by Pope Francis in Slovakia, where he talks about Mary's participation in the mission of redemption at Calvary. Well, that mission is in the obtaining of graces. It's only after those graces are obtained that they are then distributed. And that's her ongoing role as the mediatrix in a manifestation of her spiritual motherhood. Okay, number 4, and this is an important issue, and it is the tendency to rather quickly, and I think without proper foundation or analysis, dismiss a massive international Catholic movement from 1915 all the way up through the 1930s, which had other ramifications even in the 1950s, and that was the movement started by Cardinal Desiré Mercier for the solemn definition of Mary's spiritual motherhood. Sometimes you have authors that will say it was simply dismissed because of its, I want to get the quote here, because it was linguistically, culturally, ecumenically inappropriate in light of the Second Vatican Council. Well, that's a very strong claim without a lot of analysis to support the claim. And let's keep in mind who we're critiquing. we're critiquing Cardinal Mercier, who was a renowned Belgian scholar, theologian, philosopher, a great leader in both Marian development and in ecumenism. And you have hundreds of bishops, cardinals and bishops, even within the next 3 years. By 1918, hundreds of bishops have sent their support for the solemn definition of Our Lady's spiritual motherhood. You also have somewhere around 2,500 to 3,000 pages of theological support by the most reputable Mariologists of the time. So you have the 3 commissions that were set forth to examine the definability question by Pope Pius XI in 1922. You've got the Belgian Commission, who has a 150-page document supporting its definability theologically. You've got the Spanish Commission, which comes up with no less than over 2,000, most estimate almost 2,500 pages of theological support for the solemn definition. And the Jesuit Beauvais in that work is very clear that her spiritual maternity is founded on her role as co-redemptrix. And then you have Father Garrigou-Lagrange, one of the most respected theologians, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, who articulates his rationale for the definability of this. So this is a significant ecclesiastical movement, and to dismiss it as just kind of falling off is not historically accurate, nor is it fair to the quality, the magnitude of this movement, which had theology, episcopal support, and hundreds of thousands of petitions from the faithful as well. To dismiss that is somewhat comparable to dismissing the hundreds of bishops at Vatican I who requested a solemn definition of the Assumption at Vatican I. Well, as we know, it wasn't done at Vatican I. Was it dismissed? Was that the end of the issue? Of course not. That laid the foundations in a hermeneutics of continuity for the definition of Pius XII in 1950. So too, be careful of just a casual dismissal of a massive ecclesiastical, multi-formed movement for a solemn definition, which also took form in 1950 on December 1st, when an international Mariological commission in Rome unanimously voted to petition Pius XII for the solemn definition of what? Our Lady's universal mediation. Do we not see that as the ongoing manifestation of what Mercier did and founded? Yes, there were great interruptions. It was called World War II, and that interrupted most all aspects of development. But the idea that it was, left alone, left to fall off, that would be a misnomer. And history shows that it did not end there. It continues very favorably, and it should have that respect, which is part of, once again, a hermeneutics of continuity with what happened before the council, while always also incorporating the authentic spirit and doctrine that comes from the council. Number 5 is the objection that the title co-redemptrix has never been used by the ordinary papal magisterium. Now, again, distinctions are necessary here. First of all, we want to distinguish the title from the doctrine. Remember, the title, co-redemptrix, is just a one-word denotation of the doctrine of Mary's unique participation with and under Jesus, entirely dependent on our divine Redeemer in the work of the redemption. So, to say the title never appears in ordinary magisterial teaching could first of all give the misimpression that the doctrine doesn't appear, where the doctrine is quite frankly ubiquitous, especially since Leo XIII, and even some would say Pius IX before him, in the middle of the 19th century, up through the teachings of the Council, John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and even Pope Francis in the form of articulating Our Lady's unique role in Christ's mission of salvation. Second point is the title is used some 10 times by popes. We have 3 times by Pius XI in the 1930s, and then we have 7 times by Pope St. John Paul II. Now, when you're talking about ordinary universal papal magisterium, well, we have to go back to the council, right? And the council, Lumen Gentium 25, and even the surrounding texts articulate that one way you determine the manifest mind of the Pope is by the nature of the document, but also by the frequency in which a certain doctrine is taught. So you have popes who have, on 10 occasions, made reference to Our Lady as the co-redemptrix, some with explanations, like Pius XI, and as well St. John Paul II in his extended treatment in homily in Guayaquil. Now, on this note, we have to be careful of a perhaps unintended, but nonetheless objective double standard, because while the papal references of St. John Paul II and Pius XI before him are dismissed as, quote, marginal or even, quote, devoid of doctrinal meaning as elements surrounding the Czestochowa Commission put forward around the 1990s. And if you want a little bit more investigation and information on the Czestochowa Commission, we have another Mariology Without Apology that talks about that, because in fact, it was not a true commission, as the commission members have confessed. It was a one-day event with a few individuals, writing it up, but there was no serious study of the issue at all. It was a 20-minute discussion. That does not bespeak an honest, objective, professional, theological evaluation of this issue of a fifth Marian dogma. Be that as it may, you can't, on one hand, quote the extempore comments of our present Holy Father, Pope Francis, in starting December 12th of 2019, and then also references into 2020, where outside of the text of a Wednesday audience or a homily, he makes a side comment which seems to be dismissive of the idea of the co-redemptrix title or even of a definition. You can't quote that as being authoritative or seemingly of magisterial weight, and at the same time deny the 10 times that popes have used the co-redemptrix title and expressing them in like nature documents, allocutions, homilies. So which is it? Do the references of our present Holy Father 3 times extempore as a side comment that's not in the text, not in the written text, does that indicate a nature, a level of articulation that deserves an authoritative interpretation, and at the same time dismissing 10 times of Pius XI and John Paul II in not only using the co-redemptrix title specifically, but oftentimes explaining the title and using it in context of a very rich theology, especially when John Paul II uses the term, both in terms of Guayaquil in 1985 and January 31st, in a commentary on Lumen Gentium 58, but also many times talking to the sick and talking about Our Lady Co-Redemptrix as a model of our co-redeeming suffering as well. I would suggest that there would be an appropriate appreciation and not a dismissal of 10 references. At the same time, the same response to present references by our Holy Father, which by their very nature can be changed, can be developed, let us say. But let's not do the double standard. Let's not dismiss John Paul II and quote at length in full extempore comments, off-the-cuff comments by Pope Francis as if those are authoritative. That would be, in fact, a double standard. Okay, now, number 6, I almost hesitate to get into this because, quite frankly, it is so wildly unfounded. And I have to admit, when I first read this, I was at the airport and I started laughing because I thought, how is it possible that this, quote, dubious or disturbing hypotheses could conceivably enter a journal of Mariology. Nonetheless, even though it is grossly irrelevant to the whole issue, and in this case just plain factually wrong, and I don't want to give it too much time or attention, just for the sake of ultimate clarity, let's discuss this point number 6, because it was in fact raised in an article by a Roman theologian. And this is the assertion called the, quote, disturbing hypothesis that the Vox Populi Mariae Mediatrici movement, which started in the early 90s, which was seen as a continuation of the great work of Cardinal Mercier, that this movement was in fact identified as as founded upon the wildly and extraordinarily heretical and false series of apparitions, reported apparitions, entirely false, of a Canadian woman, God bless her, obviously suffering from some form of mental illness or diabolical possession or both, who claimed that she was the incarnation, the reincarnation of Mary, I kid you not, and that she and Our Lady united made up the fourth person of the Trinity. Once again, the hypothesis is that this international movement, which stems into 180 countries, over 8 million petitions, and over 600 cardinals and bishops and theologians throughout the world, that it was all founded on this false and wildly heretical series of pseudo-apparitions in Canada by the woman Marie Pauly and her organization called the Army of Mary. There were over 10 pages in a recent publication that seemed to try to associate that with the founding of the Vox Populi Mariae Mediatrici movement. And once again, it is so absolutely false. It's preposterous. It's laughable. If it weren't also somewhat something that's really more appropriate for a detective novel or a murder mystery than an authentic journal of scholarly Mariology, because it's absolutely baseless and false. So it is simply not the case in any regard that Vox Populi, a movement starting in the 1990s, continuing the Mercier's movement, had anything to do, let alone any knowledge of this extremely troubled and heresy-filled false visionary in Canada. I don't know whether the assertion seems to be based on geography, because the movement had its origin in North America, as if everything in North America is essentially connected. And really, there's simply no foundation, and there's therefore cannot be any real case for making this connection. But I make reference to it only because, once again, it's posed as a disturbing hypothesis. Well, I agree. It is certainly a disturbing hypothesis because it's foundationless, it's baseless. It gives the appearance, and I don't judge hearts, but it gives the appearance of a type of guilt by association reference that really is not appropriate for professional Mariology, let alone a proper respect of person and reputation, let alone a movement bespeaking millions of Catholics. So on that note, and I almost hesitate again to take the bait on this, because the origins of the Vox Populi movement, why I began the Vox Populi Mariae Mediatrici movement in the early 90s, is absolutely irrelevant to the merits of the case for a fifth Marian dogma. That has to stand on its own. It can't have any association with a private revelation, authentic, reported, or wildly false. It's simply an irrelevant issue. It's an ad hominem. It's a red herring, and in this case, it's a post hoc propter hoc type of fallacy. But just to again, add clarity. Why did I start the movement in the early 90s? For a very simple reason. It was because I was at that time teaching in Austria in 1991 and 1992, and I was writing a small book called The Introduction to Mary, and I brought over a number of Mariological sources, and I was so surprised by and encouraged by a number of theological articles which ended with the premise not if, but when this fifth Marian dogma would be defined. So these are articles by established and very reputable theologians in the 1990s who put forward this thesis. And I want to read you just a couple examples of this because, in fact, however irrelevant, that's why I began the International Vox Populi Mariological Treatise movement, was reading these articles. For example, J.B. Carroll, and I'm reading from J.B. Carroll's 3-volume work on Mariology, which was written throughout the 1950s. This is his article on co-redemption. And he ends the article by saying, and I don't want to read too far here in time, but just so you get a sense, at the end of identifying the article in Scripture, Tradition, Magisterium, theologically legitimate, responding to objections, he says, and I quote, "May we now advance a step further and speak of the doctrine's definability. Several eminent scholars have declared themselves favorable in this respect. We can think of no solid reason militating against their stand. Indeed, if our appraisal of the copious testimonies gathered here and elsewhere is valid and cogent, then the extant data constitute an overwhelming array of evidence pointing to the revealed character of this doctrine. Theologians may and will, of course, debate the further question as to whether it was revealed formally or only virtually. While such discussions are undoubtedly legitimate and often fruitful, nevertheless, it is well to bear in mind that the solution of this question is not at all necessary in order to proceed to a dogmatic definition. This course adopted by the Supreme Pontiff with regard to the Immaculate Conception and Mary's Assumption is an evident proof of it. Whether or not the Vicar of Christ will someday consider our doctrine sufficiently well established to be proclaimed an article of Catholic faith remains, of course, pure conjecture, but it is our fervent hope and humble prayer that the decision will be made in the not-too-distant future." So, J.P. Carroll, who writes a 600-page work in Latin on De Co-Redemptione, on co-redemption, ends with this statement of saying this seems to be a theological consensus. And as a young theologian in my early 30s, this made a big impact. Another example is the article by Father Armin Robinschad on Mediatrix of All Graces. Listen to how this ends. And these are just a couple examples of the works I was reading and saying, what happened to this movement if these great authors in the mid and late 1950s, right before the council, had such a sense of the definability? What happened to this movement? Again, just bear with me as I read the last two paragraphs of Father Robinschad's piece on Mediatrix of All Graces. He says, in similar fashion, Scripture, Tradition, Magisterium, theological support, quote, "In light of all this, our doctrine is certainly definable by the Church. There seems to be only one possible step left in its evolution, and that is a dogmatic definition. As Father Garrigou-Legrand says, it is proximately definable. In all likelihood, an eventual dogmatic pronouncement by the Church would restrict itself to the fact that all graces come to us through Mary and abstract from further questions of its mode and nature of mediatorial function, just as the Council of Trent defined that the sacraments produce grace without determining the particular type of their causality. When we review the history of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception and witness the prolonged opposition it drew from so many and so prominent theologians, St. Bernard, St. Thomas Aquinas, etc., and then compare it with the moral unanimity in favor of Mary's role as dispensatrix of all graces, we cannot but marvel that the latter has not as yet been raised to the status of a dogma. Fortunately, we have sufficient reason to believe that the long-expected definition is approaching. May it be our lot to see that day and even to assist at an event so glorious for our Blessed Lady and so consoling for all her children. So these are just two examples of many articles written in the 40s and the 50s that ended with this kind of sense of not if, but when this is defined. Why isn't it defined yet? We're surprised it's not yet defined. And clearly, Mariologists who are aware of this history know that also in 1950, as mentioned, the international Marian gathering, the greatest Mariologists of the time in Rome, on December 1st, 1950, unanimously voted to petition Pius XII for this definition. So that was, in fact, what led me to say, with a certain burning of my heart, what's happened to this? Why has it not continued after the council? That led me, in fact, in spring of 1992, to go to Rome and to meet with the Canadian Bishop, Cardinal Gagnon, very saintly man, very devoted to Our Lady. And we had a meeting, and he himself had confessed that he had already sent and forwarded a significant number of bishop petitions to the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, to Cardinal Ratzinger, for the solemn definition. So at that luncheon, with my family present as well, we decided to revive the movement. And that was the origins of Vox Populi Mariae Mediatrice. It was only later, as the movement was known in the theological community to be restarting, that I was then introduced to the reported apparitions of the Lady of All Nations in Amsterdam. But to hold that, especially to hold the idea that this Canadian false visionary, Marie Paul, this is just extraordinarily baseless, and I think to some degree very unprofessional and even uncharitable, I would dare say, because it's simply groundless. Or even the reported apparitions of Amsterdam as the foundation, neither one of those happened to be true. At the same time, I want to emphasize and leave this subject because it is massively irrelevant to the issue of the merits of a solemn definition based on scripture, tradition, magisterium, and opportunists, or the lack thereof. It doesn't matter who started the movement and what was the intention or motivation. Those are red herrings to the issue of the definability and the same means of examining what led to the definition of the Immaculate Conception, 1854, the Assumption of Our Lady in 1950, and what should be present for a solemn definition of Our Lady's spiritual maternity now. So we'll end that issue on this, again, massively irrelevant, but just for clarity's sake. Now, an eighth issue, which is a bit of a similar nature. Again, we want to be careful of hypotheses legitimate in murder mysteries, but certainly not legitimate in scholarly examinations of potential definitions, or even in an honest and fair examination of a reported private revelation. You have also, in the article of one Roman Mariologist, a hypothesis bringing up the possibility that the visionary Ida Perdaman from Amsterdam was a source of contamination for the Canadian visionary, who's not a visionary in any means, Mary Paul Jaguar. Once again, my friends, Christian charity and respect for reputation means these accusations should not happen without foundation, and in fact, there is no foundation. What is posed as foundation in this case, that in fact, Ida Perdaman from Amsterdam may have contaminated or influenced Mary Paul from Canada, is the idea in the statement that Mary Paul kept associating herself with Ida Perdaman in Amsterdam. This is simply a fallacious argument, and we just have to look to the history of apparitions for clear evidence. For example, there were over 30 false visionaries during the time of the Lourdes apparitions, and immediately following the Lourdes apparitions, 30 false visionaries, as documented by Father Cross, the major chronicle of this, that tried to associate their pseudo-experience with that of Bernadette. Does that in any way detract from Bernadette's authenticity, Saint Bernadette's authenticity, and the authenticity of Lourdes, just because false visionaries tried to associate themselves? Once again, let's be fair, let's be charitable, let's be objective as we examine these elements. And the reported Amsterdam apparitions deserve that proper justice which any human being should be receiving from the Catholic Church in any regard in terms of an honest evaluation. Examining Amsterdam, the reported Amsterdam apparitions, especially in light of the December 30th, 2021 decision to go from constat de supernaturalitate, the approval that was given by Bishop Punt in 2002, to now a non-constat, a return to the 1974 position, should be accompanied with a thorough, honest, objective evaluation based on the 1978 Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith criteria offered by Cardinal Sepper. That doesn't appear in recent commentaries and even recent critiques of the reported Amsterdam apparitions. That would be a gap. That would be a gap in a proper church, judicial process, and proper justice and respect for the individuals involved. So once again, the kind of guilt by association or the contamination is not a foundational or an appropriate type of accusation to make. It should be the visionary from Amsterdam should be investigated on the merits of the 1978 documents of the CDF. Number 9, and we're almost done here. In terms of the reported Amsterdam apparitions, just a clarification, because once again, both in certain journals, but also in public discussion of this issue, there's a lack of clarity. The December 30th, 2021 statement of the new Bishop of Haarlem-Amsterdam, Bishop Hendricks, based on encouragement, let us say, from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, is returning the status of the reported Amsterdam apparitions from approved to non-constat. Okay? It is not constat de non. So referring to them as something that's been condemned as false or not true by the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith is simply not what the congregation stated in its 1974 statement. And you can read this in the Italian. The German is very specific, as well as the French, that it is a non-constat, that the supernatural character has not been established. It is not the constat de non category, that it is prohibited, that it is condemned, that it is deemed false. And remember, this is a 1974 statement from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. There's reference that it's been approved, that it was approved by Paul VI in some disciplinary note, although that document has never circulated and it's never been shown to any bishop from Amsterdam up to this time. At any rate, even if it were approved on a disciplinary level by Paul VI, it is not constat de non. So some might maintain, well, remember in 1978, we just went to two categories, constat de supernaturalitate and non-constat. Well, sure, but 1974 is earlier than 1978, and in 1974, you had three categories. Constat de supernaturalitate consists of a supernatural origin. The middle category, it cannot be confirmed that it is supernatural. And then the third category, constat de non. It consists really of being a non-authentic apparition. It is not true. So let's be accurate according to what the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith has established. Amsterdam should be referred to as a reported apparition, always obedient to what the local bishop has said, along with the encouragement from the CDF. but to make reference that the CDF has declared it false is simply not an accurate reading of the 1974 statement. And that's from the CDF itself. Okay, the 10th issue of clarification. It is sometimes claimed that, well, the three titles of co-redemptrix, mediatrix, and advocate as relating to Mary's cooperation with grace only came from private revelation. There's no presence of it in theology. I just have to, once again, beg to differ. And let me just give you one example. This is Dr. Alistreri's work, Father Alistreri, who was the esteemed rector of the University of Salamanca in Spain. And this 2-volume work called The Blessed Virgin Mary, translated from the Spanish, again, this is back in 1952. And under the section of titles of Mary's cooperation, you have, for example, on page 158, the reference of advocate and patroness of the human race. It says in its index, and it gives an outstanding treatment of these, that the titles connected to Mary's cooperation in the work of redemption are mediatrix, co-redemptrix, spiritual mother of men, and advocate. Why? Because that's theologically accurate. These are three aspects that come from Our Lady's unique role in the redemption and expressions of her spiritual motherhood. So it is simply erroneous to say, well, that's co-redemptrix, mediatrix, and advocate just come from private revelation. That would be a gap of understanding that theologically, logically, and cogently, co-redemptrix, mediatrix, and advocate are three expressions of her spiritual motherhood, and her spiritual motherhood is founded on her co-redemption. Okay, I hope in this effort of dialogue, I mean, we are in a right sense a church in synodality, right? In listening church and a dialoguing church in certain regards. I pray that this will serve as part of that dialogue, that with some contemporary theologians who have a little bit more of an access on ecumenical and cultural Mariology, that we can see that all authentic expressions of Mariology, whether ecumenical or cultural, have to be founded on the truth about her. And so let's strive to an accurate effort for consensus on that, on what the church teaches doctrinally regarding Our Lady's spiritual motherhood and its aspects, what founds it, her unique role in the redemption, her subsequent distribution of grace, and see what could be forms of a legitimate articulation in terms of a definability. My friends, and I say this really from the heart to my brother and sister colleagues in Mariology, let's seek an honest discussion of what we can unite on, because there's another phenomenon that we're missing, and I think it's the force for the trees type of reality, and that is, we are in a spiritual battle. We are in a church in global crisis situation that, in my opinion, is in desperate need of Our Lady's mediation. And when I say that, I'm repeating the concern, the hope, the intention of Cardinal Mercier back in 1915, who maintained over and over that a solemn definition of Our Lady's role as spiritual mother, based on her co-redemption, would bring historic graces of peace to the world. Can we not agree as brothers and sisters in Our Lady that if we acknowledged her role, that in fact would allow a more full, a more generous exercise based on our fiat, our free will, of her intercession in a way that is, I think, desperately needed. I don't think that's hyperbole. It's desperately needed for the church in the world today. So let's remember, my brothers and sisters in the Marian and theological community, we have bigger opponents than each other. Let's seek as much unity as we can in an honest examination of what might be a proper articulation and conditions for a solemn definition, because I think we need that grace, the grace that can only come from Our Lady and her spiritual maternity. I think we need it more by the day. And also to underscore, we have greater and more formidable opponents than each other. So let's work together in integrity and honesty, and even if there's differences, let's see what we can affirm together, because I think by the day we're losing precious graces, and that means precious souls, because Our Lady is not being able to fully act as the spiritual mother of all peoples in a way that we desperately need her today. Thanks for being with us for this Mariology without apology. This is Dr. Mark Miravalle saying, God bless you all.